Hi, and welcome to our Johns Hopkins seminar series on the cerebellum. Today, I'm really pleased to have with us Rui Costa, who studied computer science at the University of Coimbra in Portugal, and then was a PhD student in computational neuroscience and machine learning at the University of Edinburgh, where he was mentored by Mark van Rossum and Jesper Soestrom. He conducted postdoctoral research in computational neuroscience and machine learning at the University of Oxford with Tim Vogels, then did a short postdoc with a group of Walter Sen in Bern, Switzerland, in collaboration with Joshua Bengio. In 2018, Rui started his own lab at the University of Bristol. And then in 2023, just a couple of years ago, he moved to University of Oxford, where he's now associate professor, leading the neural and machine learning group. His main interest is in developing computational models of learning. And what makes him unique is that he tries to make sense of the distinct functions that the various regions of the brain have in contributing to the process of learning in the brain. Rui, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be part of this seminar, and thanks again for running this. So, as you said, we're very much interested in learning, and our group looks at learning often from an AI-inspired perspective. And fundamentally, we're interested in how learning occurs in the brain and how different brain regions come together to do so in an efficient way. And that's a big part of what I'm going to talk about today. And as a starting point, I would argue that there's three key elements of learning in the brain. First, the need to learn a world model, which I'm going to argue that's kind of slow and gradually happens in the background. And that's because physics are relatively stable and the world is relatively stable. So there's this gradual learning happening. But when you adapt to a new situation, you need to do so quickly. And that's another key element of learning in the brain, the ability to use our world model and adapt it quickly to the environment. On top of that, we want to do this in a flexible way, right? So we might learn multiple tasks and adapt those multiple tasks in a flexible way. So I'm going to go through each of these elements and then try to map them to the brain, and in particular to the cortex and the cerebellum. So starting with learning a world model, we often think that is happening in the neocortex. So I should say that when I refer to the cortex, I'm talking about the neocortex. Whereas when we think about the ability to adapt quickly to the environment, I'm going to propose that this is done via subcortical structures, namely like structures like the cerebellum, that allows us to do that in a flexible and rapid way. So let me start by giving you a few examples of the work we've been doing over the last few years on how we think the cortex learns efficiently using ideas from AI. So first is this notion that the cortex is an inherently hierarchical structure that learns very powerful representations of the world, and the natural way to train a model in AI to do so is to use the backprop algorithm. Right. So the problem with mapping backprop to the brain has been for decades the fact that it relies on a forward phase and a backward phase. Right. So here I have a representation of the forward phase where you do the inference, you get the input at the bottom, and then you propagate that input forward when you make a decision. And then given some cost function or error function, you backpropagate those error signals and fine-tune every synapse in the right way to improve future behavior. And by being very precise about which synapse should receive credit, we can do very efficient learning. So the key issue here has been how can the brain do these two modes of computation at the same time using the same network. So how can it communicate two types of signals? And recently it has been proposed that multiplexing can be happening in the brain. So the idea that you have different types of information continuously being propagated forward and backward in the brain. And in particular here, the proposal is that you use any type of a spiking event. So anytime you give a neuron spikes, we're going to use that for inference. And we don't care so much about whether just there's one spike or as a burst of spikes. We just use that single spike, the first spike, as a signal and propagate it forward. Now we get to the output, we compare that prediction with some desired target. That then gives input to distal dendrites of pyramidal neurons, which then tends to generate bursts. We know this from work from Matthew Larkham and others, where this distal input onto distal dendrites tends to generate bursts in the soma. And now this burst is the signal for learning. So now you can propagate backwards this signal, this bursting signal across the network with many brain areas and do in principle very efficient learning. So now the proposal is that bursts, spikes in bursts carry the learning signal. So now you could in principle perform these two phases in a way in the same network without requiring very exotic solutions. So what we proposed here was to say that this maps very nicely on a very known, well-studied interneuron type, SST interneurons, which are known to exhibit short-term facilitation. So the input synapses onto these interneurons are short-term facilitating, which is exactly what you need to decode those bursts. So now we're proposing that this decoding is done via these interneurons, which then target distal dendrites, and together with the excitatory feedback, they create an AI balance, if you will, or they try to match this other feedback, and that balance determines the learning signal internally within the neuron, such that if this excitatory input is stronger than inhibitory, you end up getting bursts, and those bursts are going to change the weights of the forward connections. And we can show that this approximates a backprop very well under some conditions, of course, depending on the simplifications you make in the model. And that's the work by Will and Hank in the lab. So now with this model, we have a solution that I think allows us to do very efficient deep learning. It doesn't actually need two phases for learning. The previous model, so I'm not going to go through the details, but the previous model required two phases for learning. We don't need that. And it's actually very consistent with neuroscience at many levels, at a single neuron level, but also at the circuit level, and also at the level of how cortical areas interact with one another. So you can then, of course, apply this model to tasks where we require deep crate assignments, like this type of tasks where you present an image and you want the model to learn to classify those images across multiple layers of processing. And here just to show that under some conditions, our model is exactly as backprop. So you can see here in terms of the learning curve, but also here in terms of the alignment to backprop, 0. So this is an angle between the gradients, so the updates predicted by our model, and the gradients given by backprop. So 0 is a perfect alignment. So you can see that our model is basically at 0 right from the beginning. So then we can use this model to do more biologically plausible tasks, like a reinforcement learning task, where we can have a deep network with Q learning or reinforcement learning cost function, and that's trained to directly from pixels to train agents to navigate environments, like in this frozen lake task, for example, just as an example, and to give you also a cool GIF as an example. So we can start doing this type of learning. Okay, so that's one example of how we can, given a cost function here at the front of the cortex, which presumably is conveyed through dopamine, how can you fine-tune even sensory representations in a very efficient way by leveraging principles from backprop? But we also think that we can update the model of the world using more local principles. So we can also zoom in and look at how cortical circuits across layers, so the neocortical layers, can themselves implement self-supervised learning ideas. And that's what I'm going to briefly talk about next. That's a work led by Kevin with huge help from Noreen. And it's just been accepted recently and it's going to come out soon. So, as you know, the neocortex consists of these 6 layers. And here I'm going to focus on 3 of them and highlight that they have the key ingredients for self-supervised learning. So the idea here is that the input arrives at the thalamus, it's projected onto layer 4, but by that time this input is projected to layer 3 is effectively working with past input, t minus 1 for simplicity. This now means that layer 3 can use that past information and try to predict the next incoming input, given maybe some contextual information coming from somewhere else from the brain. And given that context and the past input can then now predict the new incoming inputs and send that to layer 5. Now we know that layer 5 also receives direct thalamic inputs. So that means that layer 5 can, in principle, compare the prediction coming from layer 3 with this new input, this new data coming in. And that means also that you have the ingredients you need to implement an error function, right? So in a self-supervised way. So you can now compare the prediction with the target, right? So the implicit target, the new data coming in. This can be in the visual space, could be the new frame, the visual frame coming in to the visual cortex. Could also be in any sensory cortex. And with this relatively simple idea, we can actually explain a lot of data, not just the connectivity itself. It provides an explanation for why the connectivity is as it is in terms of the cortical structure, but also in terms of synaptic plasticity, in terms of sparsity, why we see different activation sparsity across different layers, and more recent work by Georg Keller on mismatched responses in sensorimotor tasks in vivo awake animals. So I think it's quite exciting because it brings all these different levels together. Okay, so that's I gave you 2 examples of our own work. Of course, there's many more people working on similar lines of how the cortex can gradually over time learn a rich model of the world. But how can we now use that model of the world and adapt it to new situations in a rapid way? So that's where I think the cerebellum comes in. I think the cerebellum is perfectly placed for that. So I'm going to then argue that cerebellum allows us to rapidly adapt to the environment, but also flexibly. And I'm going to use this type of setup to make that case, where we have an RNN modeling the cortex, which receives some input and then tries to do some task on its own. But this RNN is going to have help from an external, relatively simple feed-forward network for that task. So it's going to send its activity to cerebellum network, which is relatively simple. As I said, the feed-forward network. Importantly, the cerebellum network is going to try to predict what's the task. So what the system should be trying to do. Right? So that's what this Y hat represents. So it's learning to predict, given this activity from the cortex, what's the right thing to do. So in a supervised setting will be the right target. And then sending that back to the RNN, so that RNN can integrate that information and then make an overall decision about what will be the right thing to do. Stop me at any point if there's questions. So yeah, that's the framework. Within this, we consider 3 variants of the model, so to help us make the case of why the cerebellum is useful. First, a very vanilla model where you just have an RNN with some readouts, And so there's no feedback from this readout to the RNN. Another model, which is also relatively classical now, is a model where the readout feeds back onto the RNN. And then finally, a model where we have cerebellum-like elements that sends these predictions back to the RNN. Sorry for the change of colors. Now orange is green. Okay. So I'm going to give you a brief explanation for how this model is set up. And I'm going to highlight the key elements. First, we focus primarily on the setup in the model where the RNN is fixed or relatively slow at learning. So we usually use the case of recurrency being fixed, so the recurrent weights don't change. The input weights might change and the readout can change, but the recurrency doesn't change. And that's going to be important for some of the points I'm going to make. And on top of that, then we have fast learning in the cerebellum, and the cerebellum learns in a way that's predictive. So that's inspired loosely by these ideas from Jennifer Raymond, where they found these kind of predictive learning rules, or what they call behaviorally relevant learning rules, where learning in the cerebellum happens at a particular point in time. So there's a delay between the input and output. So in this case, it will be aligned to 150 milliseconds, roughly. So we're building on that idea. We're not modeling that, I guess, in a very explicit way. So it's more in an abstract way. So that means that effectively what we do is that we write down an error function where we compare the ideal output of the model, so the target that we want to achieve, with the activity of the cerebellum a few milliseconds ago. So we test from 150 milliseconds to around 600 milliseconds. The exact time scale we use depends on the task we are going to do. So for motor tasks, we can use short delays, but for longer for tasks that are more cognitive, that require longer time scales, we need slightly longer delays. So now, given this cost function, we can train the cerebellum to give an input from the cortex, predict what's the right thing to do. So it's basically predicting ahead and sending that information to the cortex. Hopefully that makes sense. So then to illustrate the model, we start with the more motor tasks. And the first one is inspired by this classical target reaching task. We're given a green cue at the beginning, in the center. The model should reach to the green target, given a yellow to yellow target, and so on. And importantly, we give feedback to the model. So as it learns to produce its trajectory, it gets feedback on what's the right thing to do. And that's the target it's trying to reproduce. So when we look at the three variants of the model, we see that the model without feedback really struggles to do really anything, whereas the model without feedback can start doing some of it, but really struggles. It's only the model with the cerebellar predictive feedback that can produce these smooth trajectories. And that's because this is the only model that really, because you have to remember that here the model has to remember the cue, and then given that cue, go in the right, and produce the right trajectory, right? So there's a kind of a working memory component to this. So because the model with cerebellum is the only model that knows what's happening, what should be doing, what's the right thing to do in the future, it's a model that has a much better, a much easier job at producing the right trajectories. So here I'm now then showing the learning curves. So the model with cerebellum in orange, you see that's a model that learns much better to do the task. But importantly, that depends on the degree of memory you assume to be present in the RNN. So if you have perfect memory, so if you are on this side of the spectrum with perfect memory in RNN, basically it's a perfect integrator of inputs. basically you don't need the cerebellum. You can see the model with a fully plastic RNN can do it, right? So you don't need cerebellum to help it. So the RNN itself is sufficient. But when you go to the more biologically plausible regime where recurrency is leaky, so you don't remember your inputs forever, then in that case, the cerebellum helps you massively because it basically keeps refreshing the recurrency with useful information. So you should be going this direction or that direction. And it makes a massive difference in this case. Okay, so what can you do with this? So here I made the point that if you have a fixed RNN, then the cerebellum can basically give it useful inputs and help it to help the system to do the task. But in principle, you can use this RNN and control it as treat it as a dynamics engine and control it for different tasks. Right? So you can now do task 1, then quickly change to task 2, then go back to task 1 by using an external controller, like the cerebellum in this case. So for that, we then, we were inspired by this study by Perch et al., where they did something like that, where you have a task 1, which is basically represented here. It's like the task we've shown you so far. When we train the model with a fixed RNN to do the task. We also can train the model with a fully plastic RNN to do the same task. Here I'm showing the learning. So here the model has been pre-trained, so there's no error. If we now introduce a new task, which is a current version of the first task, you can see that the models learn. So this is the data, and this is the model here on top. So both the fixed RNN and the fully plastic RNN learn. Now the question is, what happens if you switch back to task 1? Of course, in the fully plastic case, you should have this catastrophic forgetting problem, right? The fact that the RNN itself has forgotten the previous task because it's overwritten that information. Whereas in the fixed RNN case, maybe that doesn't happen, right? Because maybe the cerebellum has some smart mechanism that prevents catastrophic forgetting from happening. And indeed, that's what we get. So if you have fully plastic RNN, you see that if you go back to task 1, the model fails completely to remember what it was supposed to do. Whereas in the model with cerebellum can do that just fine. And that's assuming, so the key assumption here is that we're saying that the cerebellum has some contextual dependency so that it knows that task 1 is different from task 2. But given like the high dimensionality of the cerebellum and the sparse input onto the cerebellum at the level of granule cells, that doesn't seem like a crazy, seems consistent with with how we think about the cerebellum. So that's the assumption we're making here, that for task 1 and task 2, they basically project onto different granule cells. There might be some minimal overlap, but overall they'll be relatively separate. So if it's fair to have that assumption, then we can do this rapid task switching without changing the cortex. So providing a solution for continual learning in the brain. Okay, so, and actually this by itself seems to better explain data. So in this paper, what they've shown is that when they do this switching, they find minimal changes in the covariance, so in the covariance of the activity in the cortex. So that's here represented by the dashed line, is nearly 0, so there's minimal changes. And the model that can best explain that is indeed a model with a fixed RNN. So this model here at the top. Whereas a model with a fully plastic RNN would just change its own structure substantially as it learns a new task.
Can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
Does the external signal feed into the cerebellum in your model?
By external signal,
the one that causes this. I'm interested in the switching particularly.
Right.
So you said you needed an external signal to make the switch, but my question is, does the cerebellum get an early copy of that external signal, which would make a lot of sense in my mind?
Yeah. So in an implicit way, yes, that's exactly what we do. So when I talked about this contextual switching in the cerebellum, the assumption we're making is that, I don't know if you can see my hands, but is that on the input to the granule cells is going to project onto different inputs, right, on different granule cells. So that means we say that if it's task 2, now you're going to project onto different inputs, right? So in that sense, there is that contextual information, but we don't have an explicit input onto cerebellum saying, now it should be task 2. Right? It's more about where you project to. Right? So the idea is that as information comes in from the thalamus, because of the highly sparse connectivity onto granule cells, then they would project maybe due to a slight change in the kind of task and the statistics of the inputs, it's going to project on slightly different granule cells.
Thanks.
Okay, so that now means that we have shown you that we can learn to adapt fast to the environment for a given task, but also in a flexible way for multiple tasks and do flexible task switching with this type of setup. But the question still remains on how general this is. Does these principles apply to other tasks rather than just motor tasks? In principle, by controlling the neocortex, the cerebellum has a similar role in more cognitive tasks. And I guess I don't need to motivate this for this audience, but there's now a very strong case for the cerebellum being involved in cognitive domains. So for that, we then looked at a few tasks that have been explored recently in the literature, and the first one is this evidence accumulation task, where mice are trained to lick left or right, given puffs to their left or right hand cheeks. And so in this case, we'll be given more puffs to, I think, the left. They need to lick left based on some reward signal. And when we train the model in this type of task, due to this kind of long sensory integration aspects, the model develops this strong dependency on the cerebellum. So as you can see here, so here I'm showing you the belief of the model towards licking right versus licking left. And what you can see in the control is that because it's getting more evidence towards right, should believing very early on that should be licking right. But if you remove the cerebellum, if you ablate the cerebellum, you should completely lose this ability because you forget what you should be doing effectively. And that's effectively what they see in the data in this Devray et al. Paper. They see a very similar effect. When they optogenetically inhibit the cerebellum, they see this huge drop in the ability to remember which way to go. We can also explain how this depends on when the ablation is done. So depending on where you do the ablation, the data shows that there's a dependency of exactly how important is the effect. And the model predicts similar behavior. Of course, if you ablate closer to the end of the task, so closer to the licking, ablating cerebellum should be less important, whereas ablating early on should be more important. So that there's this dependency on the task period. Okay, so then the other task we look at is a delayed association task, which was studied in this by Gao in this paper. And here we can think this is of a kind of a working memory task. It's not a classical working memory, but there's this delay period. So given a cue at the beginning, there's a 2-second delay period, and so the animals need to remember what was the right cue to make the right decision. And here, so in the model, what we see, so when you train the model for this, the model develops this stereotypical selectivity. So units in the model become selective for the task. But importantly, if you inhibit and remove the cerebellum in the model, you see this huge drop in the ability to remember what's the right thing to do. And in the data, they see something very similar. Right? So if you inhibit the cerebellum during the delay period, you see this huge drop in the selectivity. Now, importantly, before I say that, so we actually went back to the data and apply the mixed PCA on the data to kind of tell apart or extract components that were directly relevant to left and right choices. So that's in the model here. You see that early on the model develops this separation between left and right. But if you remove cerebellum at some point, this information just collapses because it forgets what it should be doing. The RNN just effectively forgets. And we saw something very much like that in the data. So the left and right variables collapse onto each other. Maybe not as perfectly as in the model, which might suggest that there's still some learning in the cortex, which is very likely, or maybe that optogenetic manipulation wasn't perfect, which I guess is also likely. So importantly, this effect doesn't happen if you have a fully plastic RNN, right? So if the cortex is kind of full plasticity and can learn very powerfully on its own and very rapidly, then you don't need cerebellum. Right? In principle, the cortex can do it on its own, or the RNN can do it on its own, and that's shown here. Right? So if you now have a fully plastic RNN, you train on the same task, you inhibit cerebellum, it doesn't have any impact. It doesn't need it. So that's summarized here. So here I'm showing you the change in error as when we ablate the cerebellum. So as I said, if you have fully plastic, if you remove the cerebellum, there's no change in error, so there's no drop in performance. It's only with this fixed RNN, or maybe even a model where the input to the cortex, the RNN is plastic. So in those two cases, there's a big drop in performance. So we're going from this slowish cortical plasticity to fast cortical plasticity. So that's one of the key predictions that the model makes. And the same is true for the other tasks. And we show that in the paper. And I think I have that here actually. So if we show the same type of plot for all the tasks I've shown you, for the delay association task, for the evidence accumulation task, and for the sensorimotor task, the same result, it's true. Okay. So then what we thought is that, okay, the cerebellum has learned, the cortex is relatively stable, but it might still be useful over time to transfer whatever cerebellum has learned to the cortex. So we kind of very much inspired by ideas from hippocampal cortical systems consolidation, where you want to gradually transfer information to the RNN and to update your model of the world with this new information. So that's a schematic of that process here. So initially, before consolidation, you depend very much on the cerebellum, but as you transfer that information to the RNN, you gradually become more independent of the cerebellum. And so we developed a simple learning rule to do this. In the last task I've shown you, the more working memory task. So that's what I'm showing here. So that before consolidation, there's a strong dependency on cerebellum, but as you transfer that information to the cortex, you no longer need cerebellum. So the RNN now has that new knowledge, so it doesn't need cerebellum anymore. Now, we actually didn't succeed in doing this consolidation in the more motor tasks. So it might suggest that there's some task dependency. It might depend on how dynamic the task is. For some tasks that are more stable, like this cognitive task, it might be possible, whereas for motor tasks that are more dynamic, it might be harder, which might maybe suggest why cerebellum has been also more linked with the motor tasks, at least classically. Okay. So I would like just to kind of link this back with another paper we had 2 years ago now, where we're proposing conceptually a related model, but different in the sense that here the cerebellum is predicting error signals directly. So instead of predicting task variables, task targets, and giving that as input to the RNN, here is predicting the feedback that RNN should receive, and then sending that directly and using that to update the weights. So it's a model for learning, right? So here cerebellum is teaching directly the cortex. So, and this is very related to this idea of consolidation as I just talked about, right? So here is a model where the cerebellum is teaching the cortex directly. So the model, the cerebellum provides these error signals, and then those are used as you perform the task to update the RNN. Whereas in the previous model I introduced just now, we don't do that, right? So the cerebellum is just driving dynamics of the RNN, is not changing it directly. But we think there's some interaction between these two, and maybe this consolidation perspective is a way to think about that. But, of course, there's a lot of work to be done. Not everything is clear to us. The other point I wanted to make is this recent paper by the lab of Alex Keiko-Cage, which is a beautiful paper and builds on similar principles where they have this idea of having multiple regions learning at the same time, one being slow, like the cortex, and another being fast, like the cerebellum, and they show that with this setup you can also learn to adapt quickly to perturbations in the environment. Their model is different from our models, so there's some interesting differences. This just came out on bioRxiv, so I encourage you to look at that as well. Okay, so take home. So here I've tried to motivate this idea that the cortex gradually, slowly learns a general model, a very rich model of the world, trying to capture all the intricacies and the details in the environment. But it's really structures like the cerebellum that allow that then model to adapt quickly to new tasks and flexibly by switching rapidly. But ultimately, you might be able to use this new knowledge and update your model of the world using this cerebellar knowledge. So I'd like to finish by thanking the people that did actual work, my funding bodies, the number of collaborators that we have interacted with over the years, and you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rui. Anybody has questions, please go ahead and raise your hand. I will call on you. Rui, if I may ask you about the Lee Miller task, the Neuron 2018 PERIC paper. That was a force field learning task that they had the monkeys learn. And one of the principles of fast and slow learning is a phenomenon called spontaneous recovery, you may know, which basically when you learn, let's say, force field A, you get pushed to the right, you learn it, and then you can set up the system so that after now you have to learn force field B, there's a competition between now the slow and the fast system, because the fast system wants to learn the new system, new task. The slow system is still working on the old task, and so you get this competitive behavior. So now afterwards, in passage of time, you see spontaneous recovery of the initially acquired memory. Is this concept something that relates to the way you've been thinking about these models?
Yes, so let me go back to this. Yeah, so in this case, we took this to the limit of having the cerebellum being completely independent from these two tasks, when doing these two tasks. And we actually show in the paper that with some overlap, you get some of that effect, right? So here, as you can see, when you go back to task one, it still takes some time to adapt to the previous task, to kind of readjust the system to do that task properly. So there's some interference going on, right? So which I think speaks to what you were saying, right? Is going back to the previous memory and fine-tuning that memory. So that's present here, and that's going to depend on how much overlap there is in the cerebellar input, but also where you project to in the cortex. So here, because we're using one RNN and we're not really saying anything about where it should project, in principle it's going to project to the same space, similar subspace. So it's likely reusing the same type of dynamics for the two tasks. but we haven't explored it in detail. I mean, I think there's a lot of work to be done here. But I think we get something like what you're suggesting already, but yeah, we need to explore it in more detail.
Frank, you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
I have a question concerning what's often believed to be a function of the cerebellum is optimization. As you now present the model, it's like fast learning. And indeed, the cerebellum has a vast amount of neurons, which is bigger than the neocortex. So is your model positing, stating that optimization is in the cortex or in the cerebellum or a mixture of both?
So here I think, so my answer is, I think it's a mixture, right? So, but here we kind of taking this a bit to the limit and saying, let's fix learning in the recurrency here. So don't allow it to learn. What do we gain by doing that, right? I mean, does that in itself explain, observations, and does that give us interesting behaviors? But in reality, I think it's both, and some of the stuff I alluded to suggests that. Now, of course, there's always been learning here in the readout. So the readout needs to learn to adapt to the new task. But in my mind, there's this joint optimization. I mean, I think the brain is continuously adapting to the environment and using different structures to do so, and I think different learning speeds to do so. I think the point here is that the cortex is going to learn more slowly, especially in adult animals. I think in young animals might be different, but in adults, once you have a stable model of the world, I think the cortex doesn't need to change as much. And as well.
So your model would agree with the position that actually the cerebellum is more important in adjustment when things are not as predicted, because there you need fast learning.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Rui, if I can ask you another question, typically systems that learn fast would also have a time scale associated with the forgetting. One would imagine that fast learning systems should have also rapid forgetting, whereas slow learning systems would have long retention. Is that a component of the memory system that you're modeling?
So let me think. I mean, we don't model that, I guess, explicitly, but it's implicit, right? In the way we think about this, right? So, the whole motivation here is that we want the cortex to be stable to a big extent, exactly because of what you said, right? Because you don't want it to change too quickly. I mean, the world is relatively stable. If something new happens in the environment, you don't want now to suddenly change your model of the world, which can cause problems like you said, like catastrophic forgetting, right? You start messing up your model and perception of the world, right? So that's why I think it's very helpful to have these two systems. I think the hippocampus is probably doing something similar to this, just in a different space with different predictions. Have these systems helping this slow learning adapt to the environment on a moment-by-moment basis, and then with time you can think about it and understand exactly what was novel, and then carefully apply your model of the world without perturbing previous knowledge.
Wonderful. Are there any other questions for Rui?
Yes, I have a second question, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead, Frank.
In one of the attractive points in the early model that I know, not the new one, is that actually the cerebellum kind of made predictions for itself. So while you still were lacking neocortical inputs,
right?
And does your current model still has this feature or not?
No. Yeah, you're talking about this model. Yeah. Yes. So the way I think about that so Frank is talking about this idea of cerebellum using its own predictions for learning more efficiently, more rapidly.
Yeah, in absence of
yes.
and an endpoint target, it
Yes.
makes predictions in the path towards the endpoint, let's say.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I don't have the schematic of that here on this talk, but yes. So, this new model doesn't use that. Now, I mean, my intuition says that I think this is critical for the ability of the cerebellum to learn fast, because by learning through self-predictions, I mean, this is a key known principle from RL. We can use in RL and machine learning. If you can learn through self-predictions, you can massively speed up your learning. And if the cerebellum is really a fast learning system, it will make all sense to use that. And if you look back at this type of modularity in the cerebellum, where different regions or different modules are predicting different things, it will make all sense for them to help each other, right? So they bootstrap on each other, and then therefore, as a whole, you have a much more powerful and better predictions, right? So to me, it will make all sense. We don't use that in this current model, but I think we should. Yeah, going forward, we should probably extend the model to do that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. It's clear.
Wonderful. Any other questions for Rui? Thank you so much. Rui, it's been great having you. Thank you for taking the time.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. Yeah.